I'm Associate U.S. Senate Historian Dan Holt, and this is The Elephant in the Room.
Welcome to The Elephant in the Room. I'm your host, Cyrus Pearson.
I'm your co-host, Carly Rapp.
And today, let's talk about us, Carly.
About us?
Yeah, the Senate Republican Conference.
Yes, today we do have the historian, one of the historians, Assistant Historian Dan Holt, joining us to chat about conference and leadership.
Yeah, and he talks about a little what the services are. And just to let people know, we offer a lot of services, but that's something that we do as part of our job. For instance, this podcast is going to shock people. I was not hired because I was a world-class podcast host.
Although you do have the voice.
I'll take your word for that. It's just an additional duty that we're doing for our standard pay. You're not getting paid more for it.
No, this is for our members as a service to have our members on and to just, And
if somebody creates these graphics because it's part of their job. So what I'm trying to say is, taxpayers, don't worry. We're not wasting your money. We're just giving you additional resources for your money. Anyway, let's hear about the history of the Senate Republican Conference. Here we go with Associate U.S. Senate Historian Dan Holt. Welcome back. You were on our Halloween bonus episode, and I have to tell you that was one of my favorite episodes.
Oh, yes, by far.
Oh, I'm glad to hear it. Thanks for having me back.
Yeah, of course. We are going to do a little secret unveiling today, possibly. We aren't really known that much as far as what a Senate Republican Conference really is. In fact, when I was hired for the Senate Republican Conference, I thought, isn't there a word after that? Committee or something? It just kind of
caucus or any other.
Yeah. So can you tell us what it is or why it exists?
Sure. It's simply stated, it is the group, the formal group of Senate Republicans working together to hammer out legislative agendas and policies, and to represent the views of the party members in the Senate to the news media and to the nation at large, and to work with the presidency when they share power between the White House and the Senate.
So you say formal. Was this something that existed before in an informal capacity? Yeah,
it's a kind of a gradual development beginning not that long after Republicans are formed as a party in the 1850s and begin to enter the Senate in numbers during the Civil War in the 1860s. They begin kind of in an ad hoc way, getting together to talk about legislative strategy. Again, during the Civil War, right? The Democrats are really a small minority here, and so they have a lot of leeway to dictate policy. They especially start to organize in that period when they are at loggerheads with President Andrew Johnson, who was nominally of their party when he was elected. And it develops slowly in the late 19th century, and then into the creation of what we think of as modern leadership, where the caucus or the conference elects its leader to coordinate with members and also represent the party to the American people.
Maybe a bit of a tangent, but I see here that you had that given us some inside info. I mean, this is something we need some advanced knowledge of.
Yes, definitely.
This goes back 1857. Republican Party sends its first members of the Senate in the majority starting in 1861. So within 4 years, took the majority over.
Correct. And that was obviously because the Southern Democrats seceded from the Union, launching us into Civil War, which obviously gave the Republicans a very large majority. The conference really comes into its own in the 1890s and into the first decade of the 20th century, when the chairmanship of the conference is taken up by William Allison of Iowa, and he works very closely with Nelson Aldrich of Rhode Island, and the two of them really kind of run the Senate from behind the scenes. They're not floor leaders in the modern sense of the term, but they're very much charged with kind of setting the legislative agenda. In that case, often, keeping a lot of things off the agenda based on the politics of the time. And, Nelson Aldrich, while he doesn't have this formal title of leader, is often spoken of at the time as the true leader of the Republican Party and of the Senate during their time of majority in the first decade of the 20th century.
And at that time, leader and conference chair were separate, right?
So in theory, there really was nobody who had the title of leader during Aldrich's Aldrich's time. That was really a kind of a colloquial term. The Democratic Party really kind of pioneered the position of leader, where the conference chair wasn't just the person who was going to run the meetings off the Senate floor, but was actually going to take an active role on the Senate floor, being there to help schedule things, to kind of control the flow, trying to control the flow and operations of the sessions, which they sort of do not very well. The parties are, both parties in this period are we could talk about this some more, are very divided. So while there are certain expectations of what the responsibility of a party leader would be in this period, nobody is particularly good at it. It really takes decades before you start to see leaders have the kind of power in the conferences that we kind of tend to think of them in the modern sense.
Why is that? I mean, was that something they're figuring out? And to give you a sense, you now have a majority and a minority leader in the Senate, so those would be the equivalent of a Mitch McConnell and a Chuck Schumer.
Mm-hmm.
Part of it is just the what levers of power you have in that position. It's also the fact that the parties, as I said, are so deeply divided on certain big issues. Like in the Democratic Party, you have pro and anti-civil rights elements throughout the mid-20th century. On the Republican side, when the Democratic majority in the New Deal, Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal is in control, you have a divide between Republicans who want to work with the reality of being a very small minority and those who want to start to build more of an opposition party during that time. And so the senators who rise up to being party leaders often are, they have to be acceptable to all elements, but in doing so, they don't have a lot of levers of power to actually, force their members to do much of anything, really.
Yeah, that's kind of along the lines of what I was going to ask is, you've got a big tent party, as we like to call it sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, how do you organize something that says this is what everybody is thinking?
I think what it really comes down to is, as you move into the 20th century and you get to certain leaders like Everett Dirksen stands out as a really important leader in this sense. He begins to personally kind of centralize power and take a very strong role in communicating with members, trying to accommodate their disparate needs. He doesn't rely on the formal mechanisms of the party so much. For example, as you pointed out, the Republican Party after the 1940s, they split the job of conference chair and leader. Well, if you have a formal conference meeting, that means the conference chair is going to be the one running the meeting. The Republicans during Dirksen's time don't call very many formal conference meetings. They do have those weekly luncheons that we've become very familiar with today, but Dirksen runs those luncheons as the leader, right? It's formally a different event that's going on when that happens. And so I think Senate leaders become more powerful as the members themselves begin to have more confidence in the leader to communicate with them and represent their disparate interests in the Senate overall. And I think that's really what you see. Really, I think, you wanted to talk about Senator McConnell, right? I think Senator McConnell has had such longevity in the office because of how well he fills that position.
So what point in history do we see all of this kind of shift in the Republican Party in the Senate where it goes, now we have a leader, the whip, conference chair, policy committee chair, how it all kind of shapes that up?
So you got to go way back. You got to go to the World War I era or the 1913 when the Democrats take control of all three branches of government for the first time in generations almost at that point. And what you get then on the Democratic side is the Democratic conference chair, who's now usually referred to as the leader, is a senator named
We'll let you
Kern,
check. Okay. Kern.
Of Indiana. He works very closely with Woodrow Wilson, and he, Wilson comes to the Senate to confer with him. They're setting up legislative agendas. They're trying to create some kind of unity among the Democratic Party, and to get past a very ambitious agenda of Woodrow Wilson. And the Republicans at this point have lost that behind the scenes power holders that I mentioned, Allison and Aldrich and a few others. They've either passed away or left the Senate. And so between 1911 and 1913, you don't really have anybody on the Republican side who's really considered to be the leader. You have a conference chair, Shelby Cullom of Illinois, but he's kind of elderly, he's senior, and he doesn't have much interest in being a real powerful person at this point. In 1913, when the Democrats come in, the Republicans, they stick with their senior member as being the conference chair, and this is Jacob Gallinger. But he really begins to be looked to for those leader responsibilities. Like, oh, the Democrats have this. We're in the minority now. We need to unite behind someone who could represent us on the floor, and maybe even more importantly, represent us to the American people as the opposition party that has its own agenda and its own ideas. And I would say that the leadership and specifically really comes into its role with Charles Curtis of Kansas in 1924, and partly because he's the first one who gets elected to the position who doesn't have seniority status. And there's a couple of reasons for that we could talk about. But in electing him to be leader, it's really clear now that he has the responsibility of speaking for the party, spearheading the Republican agenda with a Republican in the White House now in the same way that the Democrats did with Woodrow Wilson in the 19-teens.
Okay, so Curtis, you said, was the first one that initially took over that wasn't in senior leadership or seniority in the Senate in general.
Yeah, and part of that is because Henry Cabot Lodge of Massachusetts was the conference chair, and we all know he's famous for his very antagonistic relationship with Wilson and the Treaty of Versailles. He has a hard time really kind of holding the party together after that. There's the rift between the kind of the old guard Republicans and they call them the insurgent progressives from the Midwest, and being able to kind of keep those two elements of the party happy is really difficult. When Lodge passes away, there's a group of senior members who are in line to take over, but for one reason or other, nobody really wants the job. Francis Warren of Wyoming was the most senior member of the conference, but he chaired the Appropriations Committee, and he thought that would be a better use of his time. After that, you get to folks like Reed Smoot of Utah, who, the Senate didn't even want to sit him in the first decade of the 20th century because of issues about, their views on the Mormon religion at the time. Once you get past him, then you get to those, if you're looking at seniority, you get to some of those progressive insurgents like Robert La Follette of Wisconsin, George Norris of Nebraska. Nobody in charge of the Republican Party thinks that they're going to be a leader in the party. And so you get below them, and now you're looking at, okay, who are your other options? And Charles Curtis, who had been party whip at that point, and basically known as a stalwart Republican and a very strong leader, steps into the role. And so you divorce a little bit that relationship between seniority and leader. It's not just the most senior. It might also be just the person with the most skills and ability to do the job.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at leader, you kind of have to go with somebody who's going to kind of toe a party line, right? I mean, you are organizing everybody under those general thoughts. But when you get down to the conference chair, that kind of separates a little bit.
Yeah, so the Republican Party undergoes
possibly
important change during the New Deal, right? And people usually, this blows their mind. I have to quiz people on this. How many Republicans do you think were left in the Senate after the election of 1936?
Oh, I have no idea.
Might as well just fail me now.
There was only 16 of them left. Okay, there's only 16 of them left.
Wow.
The leader of the party
in 1936?
Beginning in 1937.
Wow.
There's only 16 left. Charles McNary of Oregon becomes the leader at that time. He's actually very much, I'm going to use the word accommodationist, but he worked to try to work with Franklin Roosevelt in his New Deal. He kind of came up with a lot of interest in agricultural policy, so he was very supportive of federal intervention in farm bills and that kind of thing. And so he kind of makes a name for himself as being very cooperative with the New Deal. He also decides then the party is so small, we don't really need a whip because there's only 16 of them. There's no whip, there's no assistant leader. After the war, when Republican numbers start to pick up again, is when the decision is made that floor leader is its own job. That there's something called the conference chair, and that person will preside over conferences and handle all kinds of administrative tasks in that job. But the political leader of the party is going to be its own job, the floor leader. The Democrats but don't do that, actually, just in comparison. To this day, the conference chair is the floor leader. It's kind of one job with two hats in some senses.
Interesting. So at what point does the conference chair kind of diversify from just being administrative to also having like studios and other media presence or papers?
I think you folks might know a little bit more about this than I do, since this is sort of where you're all coming from. But from what I gather, this is really a development of the late 1970s and 1980s, because the conference, with the growth in technology and I think attention on the Senate, there's this realization that the party has to have after we talked about it, right, decades of these internal divisions. Beginning in the 1980s, right, you get this slow growth of more unity in the Republican Party, right? You don't really find that there are, Rockefeller Republicans anymore. They obviously, some of the senior folks who were more moderate or liberal do stay around for a little while, but I think people would recognize that as the beginning of this period where a conservative majority starts to really be important to the Republican Party. And I think around that time, you also get this idea, okay, we need to be able to broadcast that as a unified message of the conference in the Senate. And so you start to get more television coverage. C-SPAN is created, right, with more opportunities to talk to the American people as a conference. And then, the conference itself then starts to build all kinds of more tools of communication that we see to this day with podcasts like this that lets, the party really reach out to the American people in a way that it did not do beforehand.
Oh.
Yeah, and we have been here for some recent history, and there's a lot of media, and there's a lot of media attention, and obviously the 24-hour news cycle is always on, the internet is always on. What was that communication like? I mean, we've had some chairmen who, we didn't emphasize TV or radio necessarily that much. We didn't have podcasts. We didn't have other things. It was a lot of, communication with the media. What was it like back in the day, quote unquote?
I think the leaders themselves were still very much the focal point of that kind of media outreach. And Everett Dirksen is famous for this. He was kind of made for it. He had a background in theater, and he had this, this wonderful baritone voice, and he really enjoyed speaking to the media. I think it was probably his favorite part of the job. And so during the 1960s, he began to work with his counterpart on the House side to have regular media spots and meetings with the media. It got famously dubbed the Ev and Charlie show. Charlie was Hackett was the Republican leader on the House side. And they would meet regularly and with the media in order to kind of bring across, again, the minority viewpoint in a country that was dominated by the Democratic Party in this time. The other thing that you get that leaders do kind of a little more quietly was they would actually meet with members of the press on a daily basis on the chamber floor in what they call dugout sessions, dugout chatter, they would call it. And this was really began before you had C-SPAN, so that people could look into what was going on the Senate floor. And they would meet with reporters to kind of give them a sense of what was going on a daily basis, especially, the beat writers who covered the Senate frequently. And I think that really morphed into what became much more formalized, press conferences that you see out in the Ohio clock corridor on a daily basis now. And so those kind of more informal dugout chatters went by the wayside. So I think in that sense, and even today, right, the leader, despite the work that the conference does, the leader is the more recognizable figure that the people see on their TV screens more often. And so, that part of the job is very important.
Yeah.
Can we talk about how the leader is chosen today? And then I know you have done a lot of research into contested elections in the past.
So it's leadership elections are secret ballot elections. Today, they to kind of signal, I think, the import of the event, they take place in the old Senate chamber. And they've done that since the chamber was restored in the 1970s. And because they're secret ballot, there's a lot of maneuvering that has to go on, right? Presumably among those who are, they are your colleagues. You have to work close together with them, but you have to strategize and you have to campaign, and that can be, a very difficult thing to do.
And that's among like 50 people.
Yes, I mean, and so there's a lot of work to do to get the support that you want, and it's also just very uncertain. You don't know where your support is until those ballots are cast, and so you'll hear stories of senators who ran for office, being disappointed that they thought they had the votes, and then it turns out that there were a couple of defections, and they might not know who those defections are, although they might have a hint of an idea, but they may never know for sure unless somebody owns up to it.
As it is a secret ballot.
Because
you can't
a secret ballot.
find out.
Yeah, maybe a lot of reality TV shows, Survivor style, that people can learn from. Unfortunately, politics goes into that. Do you want to pick a couple of these contested elections and talk about what you think are some of the interesting ones?
Sure. And much of the Republican conference's history in the Senate, these leadership elections, when they become open, like an open seat, it's rare that a sitting leader will be challenged at the start of a Congress. But there are these periods where the leader has either lost election or passed away or stepped down for whatever reason, that it kind of gets wide open. And those they can end up being races of just, one or two that represent those moderate and conservative elements of the party in the mid-20th century. And sometimes it could be a little more wide open where you have maybe a conservative and a liberal and a moderate, and they're all jockeying for position. So, for example, one good race that kind of came down like that was in 1969 after the death of Everett Dirksen, who at that point had been in the leadership for longer than anyone. You had a breakdown of Hugh Scott, who was kind of a Rockefeller Republican with the most seniority of the challengers. And then you had Roman Ruska, who was kind of the old guard conservative in that time. And then to kind of make it more complicated, you had the newly arrived Howard Baker, who was a bit of a moderate, trying to, create compromises between those different groups. And, ultimately, it was one of those things where Ruska was in the race, and members of the party said, you kind of might want to step out of this race, because if you don't, then the liberal might win this election. And so he, after a while, he decided that he would do so. But nevertheless, Hugh Scott, the liberal Republican of the time, was able to prevail by 5 votes.
Wow.
I think what's also important there is it shows how important seniority still was. When in doubt, I think the conference was usually bent towards the individual who had the most experience in the body and the most experience, really crafting a legislative agenda and getting things passed. So for example, I think that's also true of the race. And
before you move on to that was only 5 votes. And I don't know how you remember all these names and all these dates, and I applaud you for it, because I sure as heck couldn't do it. Any tension left over from just that close, or does everybody get together and move on after these?
I think there's always existing tension, especially in this period, right? So this is in the Watergate era. The Senate is still controlled by Democrats in this time, with Nixon in the White House. And Nixon is, right, even though he's, in general, I think people would say, understand he's quite conservative, but he was also very cognizant of trying to build national coalition. And so he was, willing to sign things into law that came from Democrats. And I think the Republicans in that time had that, that difficult decision of, do we oppose? Do we try to shape legislation? And then when Nixon got into all his trouble, then you had, okay, do we stand with this president, or do we finally signal to him that we have to move on? And I think that was very much a dividing point in the party in the early 1970s.
Interesting.
Okay.
All All right, I won't interrupt you anymore. You can move on. Thank you.
On this, this kind of free-for-all race, I was just going to mention the race that you get after Howard Baker leaves in 1985. Bob Dole of Kansas, would presumably be, I think, the most popular candidate at the time, but he also had to deal with or contend with Ted Stevens of Alaska, who was a very powerful member and I think well liked within the conference. And then you had folks such as Richard Lugar of Indiana, Pete Domenici of New Mexico, and James McClure of Idaho. So you have this five-way race, and again, right, there's a lot of strategy there. But in this case, what they do is when they do the balloting, whoever gets the lowest vote gets removed, and then they revote
vote again until it gets to it.
You get down finally to a Dole and a Stevens, and Bob Dole is victorious. And again, I think also because he had the most experience in the conference, and so there was, I think, a lot of trust that he was going to be able to communicate with members and represent them well in that job.
Out of some of these contested elections, how often did it come down to a secret ballot, or did sometimes people just drop out before it even got to that point?
There's certainly, you'll read in the press about potential races that are going to happen, right? As people are talking about it. But there's definitely, in many cases, individual senators who are trying to kind of reach that consensus among everyone, so that by the time you get to the vote, it might be more or less unanimous. And a good example of that would be Robert Taft. So Robert Taft is really interesting because he really kind of led the Republican Party from behind the scenes for a while. He took charge of, first he reconstituted and then took charge of what became the Republican Policy Committee during the 1940s. And from that position, Taft was very much a policy-oriented guy. He's very cerebral, and was using that position to kind of create what he wanted to be like a conservative vision for governing in a way that the previous leader, Charles McNary, did not do under the New Deal, where he was more open to working with the Democrats and Franklin Roosevelt, and then maybe Truman. And so Taft kind of runs things from behind the scenes and doesn't put his name in there to be the leader. But finally, after a few years in that position, in 1952 or at the start of 1953, first of all, I should say he wanted to run for president. He wanted to get the nomination for his party for president. He doesn't get that in 1952. There's that split between Eisenhower and him as like the two different wings of the party, the more liberal, moderate Eisenhower wing. Taft wants to really represent the conservative wing of the party. And now I think, says, okay, I may be up for taking this job of leader. And it's certainly not perfectly paid for him to do that, but by the time the kind of maneuvering gets done, it's a unanimous decision to make him the leader at that point in 1953. Okay. Which he sadly only gets to do for a very short time because he gets ill and passes away in the midst of his service. So led for a long time behind the scenes, only for a little bit of time as the official leader of the party.
Yeah, if you like history, I mean, these are real stories, real people behind it. I want to mention the Dole election, 3-vote margin on that one.
Yeah, it was really close. And I should have said before, too, again, even more close votes. When Howard Baker, who lost that 1969 contest, he comes back. I forget which position he had, but he was, he had position in leadership, if not the leader. And he ran in 1977, and he was opposed by Robert Griffin of Michigan. And that election came down to a single vote.
One single vote.
Yeah. So,
wow.
And you think about the margins when you're trying to work with the conference and who you think is going to go your way. Very little margin of error.
And so they don't re-vote or anything. It's one vote and that wins it.
That's a good question. I'd have to. We don't have those minutes, so I wonder if anybody said, "Hey, that was really close. Can we do that again?"
Interesting. You never know.
It's certainly possible.
Yeah.
It's getting juicy in here. I'm kind of curious about this one where we had a senior senator and junior senator from the same state running for the position when we had a Trent Lott versus Thad Cochran. Can you talk about that one?
So in the mid-'90s, Bob Dole, who had been very successful in his position for about a decade at that point, resigned so that he could focus on his presidential campaign. And that left the seat open. And this was in a period where, right, it's just 2 years after the Republican Revolution on the House side. the Republicans are now in control of the Senate as well for the first time in a decade, and the contest there is between two Mississippians, one maybe a little more senior than the other, but I think Trent Lott is able to kind of convey that he's the most in step with the rise of the Newt Gingrich wing of the party over on the House side, and I think that's where the party is going in this period, right? Remember I said that slowly but surely that division within the party starts to kind of lead to a period of unity, and this is really one of the key times when that happens, such that Trent Lott, this one is not close. He wins by a vote of 44-8 over his colleague Thad Cochran.
Wow. And who was the junior senator in that scenario?
Well, I think it would have been Trent Lott.
I think it was Trent Lott.
Trent Lott,
Yeah.
and he won over the senior. Wow.
So again, and that's another change, right? I had mentioned that I think kind of seniority was kind of always a factor in those elections, and that becomes less so. And then when Trent Lott himself has to step aside, it's not a contested election, although it sort of is, because before he formally steps aside, Bill Frist of Tennessee announces that he's going to challenge him for leadership. And Bill Frist is in the middle of his first term, I believe, or maybe he had just finished his first term when he steps up to. I think he just started his second term, I believe. And so not a very senior member of the party, and he has the support of the conference to take over that position.
Amazing.
Yeah, I find it really interesting because I've worked with every one of them going back to when you talked about Domenici and Lugar and Stevens. McClure, I didn't. That's the latest one I have not worked with. But for me personally, this is interesting. What do you think is interesting about having, because you've done research on it and you've looked into it, what is interesting about having a Senate Republican conference chairman?
I think it's important because it shows, one, that, there's this idea among the public when it comes to political parties, and I'm kind of a broken record on this, but I think it's important to emphasize that the party is just a unified front, right? And that is something that just happens naturally. And I think it's clear from the experience, and this is true of, I think, of both parties, that is not the case, right? That it takes actual organizational work to craft that unification, and it takes organizational work to just handle basic things about, the Republican conference now and this goes actually, I think, way back, and I haven't mentioned it, but it has a role to play in, election of candidates around the country, right? You have the conference appoint a campaign committee chair, and that person's job is to try to cultivate candidates around the country and to help get them support to be elected, to grow your majority if you got one in the Senate. And so I think it's really key that you have, the leader is this important position, and they're the most recognizable from the American public. But the fact that you have a lot of difficult work that goes on behind the scenes, and that individual who takes that job is kind of willing to do that. It's very much a service to your colleagues kind of job, that I think is worth, even though they don't get the most press, it's important to know that they exist, and they're doing a lot of that legwork to help shape the legislative agenda, shape the vision of the party, shape the public message that you're going to have, and again, shape everything all the way from sponsoring bills and all the way down to cultivating new members of the party.
Yeah.
I have one more question. Do you want to go with anything?
No, go for it.
First off, if people are interested, how do they get in contact with your office to find out more information? Because there's a lot here that we just don't have time to get into.
Yeah.
And if you like history, there is a lot to really dig into here.
Yeah, we try to get a lot of stuff up on Senate.gov on the website, but there's always more to add, and not all of this gets on there because it would just be in some ways too much. So yes, we are always available to field questions, especially from staff in the Senate, but also the public listeners who are listening. We can be reached at email at historian@sec.senate.gov. You can reach us by phone at 202-224-6900.
That was so clear, I don't think I have to repeat it. And finally, Dan, sometimes we go out of order and, we skip over some stuff. Is there anything you found interesting in your research that you'd like to mention before we end today?
Well, the one thing I didn't address, which you had asked on the forum, was about caucus versus conference.
Yeah.
And that's worth, and I think I've jumped back and forth in using the term, so it's
okay.
So people often ask, what is the difference between a caucus and a conference? Because the term is used interchangeably to describe the Republicans and Democrats in the Senate. And while they're used interchangeably, they are rooted in a difference. In the late 19th century, the idea of a caucus was that this would be a binding meeting, that members would meet together to arrive at some kind of policy agreement that all members of the party were, in theory, bound to support on the Senate floor. Senators in the late 19th and early 20th century were very leery of committing in those ways. The Democratic Party passed a resolution that said you needed to have if 2/3 of the caucus approved of something, that bound all members. But they had to create all kinds of loopholes so that they could get out of it. And senators didn't want to, at the time, really be seen as, only voting by party. So what happens is in the 19-teens, the word conference becomes adopted as a way to distinguish. So a conference, right, is a place where members are meeting to discuss ideas, to confer,
right.
and try to arrive at those visions, but it doesn't imply that anyone has to vote a certain way.
They're not bound by it.
Yeah, which is really important because, as I keep saying, divisions within the party, you're not going to get all members to support what the majority of the party might want.
Right. So if you're part of the conversation, you want to go to the conference, you may be a little hesitant to caucus.
Exactly.
Okay.
That's why it's more accurate to use the word conference nowadays.
Well, Dan, always interesting. I'm always glued here. Thank you so much, and we look forward to hopefully having you on again.
Yes.
I'd be glad to. This was great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, appreciate it.
Carly, what was the most surprising thing or one of the most surprising things you learned today?
One of the most surprising things I learned today was that back in the day, years ago, the conference chairman role was not separated into chairman and leader. They were combined as one.
Yeah.
Which is very interesting, just as the way it works today has changed drastically.
Yeah, I mean, things develop over time, you just assume. But, I mean, the role, I can tell you, the way it operates today, it is a behemoth for one person to bite off. So, yeah, those roles do need to be split. I'm going to give a little credit to the guy who hired me, Henry. Had 20-plus years here. I've had about 24 almost. I'm on 23-plus right now. David stuck around. He was here for 25-plus years. Chris, 30-plus years.
Wow.
And then Lane and myself, we were just talking this morning how things have changed. It was me and him running things for a good 7 to 9 years here.
That's amazing.
Just
and you're
the TV
still
department.
learning.
Oh, yeah. Always learning. If you'd like to be notified each time a new episode comes out, please follow, like, or subscribe. It's just an easy way for the app to bring it to your attention. And isn't that the point of computers, to make our lives easier?
Yes, it is.
The Elephant in the Room is brought to you under the direction of U.S. Senator John Barrasso of Wyoming. He is the Senate Republican Conference Chair. Executive producer is Arjun Modi. Show producer and co-host for today is Carly Rapp. Thanks for sitting in, Carly.
Thanks for having me.
Technical director is Rashad Smith. Thanks for listening. And until next time, this has been The Elephant in the Room.